So I was the only teacher in the whole school today that volunteered to actually be in the TCAP room because I knew I could pace and tell my story in the room to myself, and nobody else would know what I was doing. But, okay, one, Elizarov. So it wasn't until about 40 or 50 years ago that people knew or could even imagine that the human bone can regenerate itself. But it was Dr. Sergei Elizarov, a Russian doctor who was studying soldiers with gunshot wounds whose bones were shattered, that discovered on his x-rays a ghostly apparition in between two fragments of bone, as if they seemed to be reaching out for one another, trying to become one again, trying to become whole. And he realized, to his astonishment, that the bone was regenerating itself. Osteosynthesis, as they call it, and one day it would become the biggest word in my life. So what do Russian soldiers and gunshot wounds and all of this have to do with my life and my family? This is the story of 6 centimeters of new bone, of an unbreakable little girl, and my family. So Evelina Hope Goldman was born 1998, April 30th. She was a healthy baby. She was 7 pounds, 9 ounces. Her APGAR was great. She was reaching out her arms like this and blinking her eyes. And she was awaited by her big sister, who wasn't quite 2 years old yet, who just couldn't wait for her new best friend to arrive. And her personality emerged shortly after that. If I could think of anything to describe her, it would be buoyant. She just seemed to have a talent for returning to her natural state of equilibrium and joy, and she had this just sort of infectious laughter that could make everybody around her smile. And for reasons that would comprise another story entirely, I was soon to become a single mom, but still, I recall this time as being hugely joyful. I had 2 beautiful little girls. I was living in Manitou, had this great community, some of whom are out there right now. And her childhood was textbook normal. Everything was really fine, and we were fine. But at the age of 3, I started to notice just a little something, that her leg seemed to be growing just a little bit inward. And I took her to the pediatrician, and he reassured me, well, toddlers, they're typically knock-kneed, and there's really nothing to worry about yet. But my very, very intuitive mother really insisted that it was something more than that. So a quick visit to the orthopedist in Denver confirmed that she was right. A little tiny piece of cartilage had kind of lodged itself into the growth plate on the side, and nobody knows why, but it shut down the growth entirely. And so the result was that the inside of her bone was growing at a rapid rate, whereas the outside of the bone wasn't, causing it to curve. But since this is the story of my family, I have to stop here and back up to introduce one of the key characters. So enter Matt Malarchik. He was, I had met him about a year before, and he was this really, really cute photographer. And he sort of popped out of the back of a VW van and tried to force this leftover wedding cake on me, which is so weird. But that too is another story entirely, because this is the story of love in my life, but it's not the story of my love life. So I could tell you that someday. But anyway, he went back to his home in Alaska, and I never expected to see him again. But I did a year later, and the most miraculous thing is that he was moving in next door to me. So the girls and my cat immediately picked him out as a good guy, And they would go over there all the time, and I'd have to like march over there and retrieve them all and bring them back to the house and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like, it's fine. But even so, the girls kept going over there, and even as the spring came, they'd go over there early in the morning, and they'd be wearing their little dresses, and they'd be twirling around. And he remembers Evie saying, even at the age of 3, Evie saying, "Maddie, aren't I beautiful today? Isn't this just your favorite dress?" And he'd say, "Well, yes, of course you're beautiful today, but does your mother know where you are?" And so he'd march them on back to the house, and I knew exactly where they were, but I had a crush on him, so I just really wanted to see his face in the morning. But anyway, this was really, really far away from a typical boy meets girl story, and I was far from the typical girl next door. A couple months after we met, we all fell in love. But a few months later, we found ourselves at the Children's Hospital preparing for Evelina's surgery. And her doctor, Dr. Sink, explained to us how he was going to cut away the diseased bone, and then he was going to take a little fat graft from her tiny little butt cheek and put it in the hole that he had made, hoping that it would spur the bone growth. And so we did this, and she was fine, and she had a pink cast that was from toe to hip, and she hammed it up at the Children's Hospital, and made everybody laugh, and played with the other kids. And anyway, I wish that were the end of the story. I honestly do. But it's not. A wise storyteller told me that you should tell the last story that you want to tell, the story that's hard. And this is the story that's hard. This is the story that hurts to tell. So life went on for us, but Evelina's bone did not cooperate. And so it continued to grow more and more in an arc. It continued to grow more and more bow-shaped. So it was almost like in x-rays, it was like the shape of a banana. And the doctor, when she was 9 years old, said that we had to intervene or there would be some consequences. So what happened next is we were faced with this crazy decision that felt a little bit like one of those really, those when you're bored, those would you rather games that you play, like, would you rather have bad breath for the rest of your life, or never be able to do laundry again, or would you rather have to walk on glass forever, or never be able to taste your food? But this was real. I couldn't believe they were telling us what they were telling us, but they said we would have the choice either between shortening her stature by 3 to 5 inches, by truncating her perfectly normal right leg and making it match the left leg. Or we could go through this bone lengthening process, osteosynthesis, in which we would actually force her to grow new bone. But the thing is, it involved 7 to 8 months of agonizing pain. It's one thing, I will tell you, to watch your child go through pain. It's another thing entirely to know that you'd be the one inflicting it. Nonetheless, we knew that 7 months compared with a whole lifetime wasn't really a long time, and we wanted the best outcome for her, so we went for it. So, August 10th, 2009, we went in for Evie's surgery at the Denver Children's Hospital, where her orthopedist, Dr. Pulowski, cut her femur in half, horizontally, and then he inserted 6 quarter-inch steel rods in through the bone, out through the muscle and skin, and they attached to 2 halos around the bottom and the top of the leg, between which there were 6 adjustable struts. When Evie woke up from this procedure, I completely wanted to scream. I wanted to call it off. I wanted to say, no, take it back. I didn't mean it. I can't do it. But Matt was there, and Mimi was there, and it was done, and we had to move forward, and we did, with love. So I did what the other parents at the children's hospital were doing. I put on my game face, and I snuggled, I read stories, I played games, and finally, after a week, we were allowed to leave. And that's when the real work began, because it took us an hour to get into the car because every single movement hurt. And then once we were at home, Matt and I nightly had to adjust the struts. We had to turn, and a single click would separate the bone by just a millimeter. Sometimes we had to use a wrench to do this. But if you can believe it, that's the least barbaric thing that we did. We actually had to clean the open wounds where the steel entered the body nightly, and she'd be screaming out, and Matt and I would be crying in the bathroom, and Mimi would be holding her hands. But still, it got worse. We had to do physical therapy, and sometimes it took 30 minutes for us to get her leg to bend less than 40 degrees, because doing so meant moving steel through muscle and skin. It was horrible. But that's not it. That's not the whole story, really. There was so much joy and so much adventure and so much creativity in our lives, so many things that Matt did as a loving father to make it okay. And I only have 5 minutes, so I could go on and tell you thousands of them. I could tell you about how he painstakingly turned her crutches with electrical tape, he turned them into crutches that looked like candy canes and put rubber balls on the end of her steel rods. He also he turned her weekly visits to Denver into adventures to the Children's Museum and to the Science Museum and to concerts and to parks, and did everything he could to help her live a normal little girl's life. But the other thing he did was he reacted as an artist. He took photographs daily. He took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and the photographs were beautiful. And they were painful sometimes, and they told a story. They told a story not just of pain, but of joy and of love and of play and of adventure. And because we were all sharing this experience, we just sort of felt like we were knitted into our own little universe, the four of us, because we had tons of support in the community, but nobody could really seem to... nobody knew what we were really going through because they just weren't in it front lines like that. But Matt started to reach out to our family and friends by posting these photographs on Facebook. And soon it became known as the Evie Project. And before we knew it, there were hundreds of followers, people we didn't even know, and people who were reaching out from the furthest reaches of the country and commenting and looking forward to the photographs. And finally, the process was over for us, and it was the most incredible feeling of relief and joy and anticipation when we finally got to have this metal behemoth removed from her leg and she could go on living her life. But meanwhile, the project that Matt had created, even though he never intended it to be an art project, he's an artist. And art and life, for an artist, I think, are not really separate. So what he had eventually created was a work of art. And Daisy McConnell, one of our real-life friends, but also a friend on Facebook, happened to notice the value of this project, and she asked him to show at the Goka Gallery the whole project. So the show was projected for a few years later, and our hearts got to heal, and we got to go on with our lives. But as Matt began to make these photographs, he had to sort of open up these memories and these emotions and kind of open up sealed times in our lives. And I imagine that he went through something like I'm going through now, having to look back, even though we're past this, having to look back and open up this experience in our lives. But he did, and the result was the most incredible thing. When I saw all these photographs lined up that represented a year in our life, I didn't see a story of agony. I saw a story of courage. I saw a story of a little girl who went from wheelchair to walker, to crutches, to moving freely. A little girl who had the courage to be herself in her crazy rainbow tights and tiaras, no matter how much pain she was in. A little girl who was playing on the monkey bars and riding her scooter, even though we knew it hurt her because she refused to be anything but a normal kid. So Matt had hoped, he never knew it would be this big a project, but he had hoped that one day he'd be able to hand Evie a box of photographs just to show her what a badass she really was. And is. I think she knows. Anyhow, if you ask Evie about this, well, if you ask me, I'm still ashamed and I still have pain in telling you this story, because how can a loving mother reconcile putting her child through so much pain, even if it means the greater good? But if you ask Evie about it, she'd say that she wouldn't undo a single moment. She'd say that having gone through this made her the human being that she is. It's given her a sense of compassion and feeling and knowing for the suffering that people go through in life. And so I'll just end by saying that she's a beautiful girl, and she's a teenager now, and she has these scars, and those are beautiful too. But we were faced with the prospect of a plastic surgeon who offered us the opportunity to get rid of the scars or to help her with the scarring. But when we told Evie this, she said, "No way. I earned these scars. These scars are my story." It's my story.